felt that feeling of completely losing control? When something inside you awakens and there's no turning back. Marcus Thompson knew that feeling well, but he never imagined it would one day become literal. Working as a bouncer at one of Portland's busiest bars, Marcus always managed to remain calm, even in the most tense situations. His imposing presence and steady gaze were enough to discourage most troublemakers. But there was something different about that full moon night, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. The Moonlight Tavern was known for attracting a diverse clientele, from workers looking to unwind after a long day to college kids looking for a good time. Marcus had worked there for almost 3 years and knew every corner, every shadow, every sound that echoed off the dark wood walls. The rustic decor with elk antlers and old photographs created a welcoming atmosphere during the day. But at night, under the dim light of the yellowish lamps, the place took on an almost somber air. On that particular night, Marcus felt a strange discomfort. His hands trembled slightly, and an inexplicable heat crept up his spine. He attributed the sensation to fatigue. He had been working double shifts the past few days to cover for a colleague. But in the back of his mind, a voice whispered that this was different, that something was changing inside him irreversibly. The first sign of trouble came when a middle-aged man, clearly drunk, began bothering a young woman at the bar. Marcus approached with his usual professional demeanor, calmly explaining that the behavior would not be tolerated. The man glared at him with contempt, his bloodshot eyes revealing hours of heavy drinking. Marcus felt something stir in his chest, an anger that seemed to come from a very deep, very primal place. The situation escalated quickly as the drunk customer shoved Marcus hard, shouting obscenities and threats. It was at that moment that Marcus first felt the transformation begin. His pupils dilated, his muscles contracted painfully, and a low growl escaped his throat. The other customers began to back away, instinctively sensing that something very dangerous was about to happen. Marcus tried to control himself, take a deep breath, count to 10 as he always did. But this time, the method that had always worked failed completely. He could feel his bones lengthening, his teeth sharpening, his senses sharpening preternaturally. The sound of glasses clanging against the bar echoed like thunder in his ears, and the smell of fear from the patrons became almost tangible. The full moon shining through the bar's windows seemed to beckon him, awakening something ancient and fierce that had lain dormant his entire life. Marcus's reflection in the mirror behind the bar began to distort. His familiar features became more angular, more savage. The veins in his neck throbbed visibly, and his hands, once steady and controlled, trembled with a destructive energy he had never experienced. The aggressive customer continued to shout, oblivious to the approaching danger, his intoxication blinding him to the obvious signs that Marcus was no longer fully human. The other bartenders watched the scene with growing concern. Sarah, the bartender who had worked with Marcus for 2 years, immediately noticed something was wrong. She knew Marcus's calm temperament, his ability to diffuse conflict with words rather than violence. But the man she saw now was different. His eyes gleamed with a predatory intensity, and his movements had acquired an animal fluidity that made her skin crawl. The bar's ambient music, a soft mix of classic rock, was abruptly interrupted when Marcus, in an involuntary movement, crushed the remote control in his hands. The silence that followed was broken only by the heavy sound of his breathing and the nervous murmurs of the patrons, who were beginning to realize they were witnessing something extraordinary and terrifying. Marcus's transformation didn't happen all at once. It was an agonizing process lasting several minutes, each second an eternity of pain and confusion. His muscles contracted and expanded beneath his skin, creating a grotesque spectacle that mesmerized and horrified onlookers. The aggressive client, finally realizing something was terribly wrong, tried to back away, but his drunken legs wouldn't obey quickly enough. Marcus could feel his human consciousness struggling against something far more primal and powerful. It was as if two entities inhabited the same body. The rational man he had always been, and a savage creature awakened with a thirst for violence. His childhood memories in a small Oregon town began to blur with images of dark forests and hunts under the moonlight. He couldn't distinguish between real memories and ancestral instincts that seemed engraved in his DNA. The first scream echoed through the bar as Marcus grabbed the customer by the neck. His hands, now equipped with half-grown claws, left deep marks on the man's skin. The smell of blood awakened something even more ferocious in the creature Marcus was becoming. His eyes, still human but filled with a supernatural rage, fixed on the terrified face of his first victim. The other customers went into a panic. Chairs flew through the air as desperate people tried to reach the exit door. But Marcus, or whatever creature he was transforming into, was faster. With a leap that defied human anatomy, he blocked the main exit, growling low like a territorial animal protecting its prey. His orange shirt, which he always wore to work, began to rip under the pressure of muscles growing beyond their normal limits. Sarah tried to use the phone to call for help, but her hands were shaking so badly she could barely dial. Across the bar, the night manager, a man named Tom Bradley, watched the scene with growing horror. He had personally hired Marcus, impressed by his impeccable credentials and calm demeanor. He never could have imagined bringing something so dangerous into his establishment. The second victim was a young college student who tried to escape through a back window. Marcus intercepted him with supernatural speed, his movements now completely animalistic. The boy tried to scream for help, but his voice was muffled as Marcus's partially transformed hands silenced him permanently. The blood that dripped onto the bar's wooden floor created a macabre pattern that reflected the light from the overhead lamps. As the carnage continued, Marcus's human side watched in horror from the depths of his own mind. He tried to scream, to beg for it to stop, but he had no control over his own body. It was like watching a horror movie from a first-person perspective, knowing he was simultaneously the protagonist and the monster. Guilt and terror mingled in his fragmented consciousness, creating a psychological torment that compounded the physical pain of the transformation. The full moon shining through the windows of the Moonlight Tavern seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, synchronized with the rapid beating of Marcus's heart. Each ray of silvery light that touched his transforming skin intensified the metamorphosis, as if the natural moon were a catalyst for the emerging monstrosity. The hairs that had begun to sprout in irregular patches across his body created a bizarre pattern, still human enough to be recognizable, but too animal to be natural. The sound of shattering glass echoed through the establishment as more patrons tried to break the windows to escape. But Marcus, now operating purely on predatory instinct, seemed to be everywhere at once. His heightened hearing picked up every desperate breath, every heartbeat racing with terror. The bar, which moments before had been a welcoming refuge, had become a death trap from which no one would escape alive. The third victim was Sarah, the bartender Marcus considered a friend. She had hidden behind the counter, trying to control her labored breathing as she listened to the horrific sounds of carnage around her. Marcus found her easily. His heightened sense of smell detected the familiar perfume she always wore, now mixed with the acrid scent of fear. When their eyes met, Sarah saw a glimpse of the man she knew behind the bestial mask, and for a moment, she believed she could reach him. Sarah tried to speak to Marcus's human side, reminding him of conversations they'd had, of times he'd protected her from troublesome clients. Her words seemed to penetrate the haze of violence consuming Marcus's mind, and for a few precious seconds, the transformation seemed to falter. His claws retreated slightly, and his eyes regained some of their lost humanity. But the moon continued to shine through the windows, and the smell of spilled blood was a constant reminder of the predatory nature that had been awakened. The moment of hesitation was brief. The creature Marcus had become couldn't distinguish between friend and prey. Every human in the bar was equally vulnerable, equally appetizing to his newly awakened instincts. Sarah realized her words wouldn't be enough when she saw Marcus's muscles contracting again, preparing for the final attack. She closed her eyes, whispering a silent prayer as she accepted her inevitable fate. The carnage continued methodically and brutally. Marcus, or whatever creature he had transformed into, seemed to follow an instinctive hunting pattern. He isolated each victim, savoring the terror in their eyes before striking. His supernatural strength rendered any attempt at physical resistance futile. Solid oak tables were shattered like matchsticks when thrown in his direction. The brick walls of the establishment were stained with evidence of the unfolding violence. Tom Bradley, the manager, tried a different approach. He'd known Marcus for years and believed he could appeal to his professional nature. He barked instructions as if Marcus were still his employee, ordering him to stop and regain control. But the words sounded pathetic and desperate in the chaotic atmosphere of the bar. Marcus turned to him with a look that held no trace of human recognition, only the primal hunger of a predator who had found its next prey. Marcus's physical transformation was nearly complete. His height had increased considerably, his muscles becoming defined in a way that defied normal human anatomy. The snout that had begun to form was now fully developed, equipped with fangs that dripped saliva mixed with the blood of his victims. His human skin remained visible in many areas, creating a grotesque contrast with the patches of dark fur that covered other parts of his body. The sounds escaping Marcus's throat were no longer remotely human. They were deep, primal growls that reverberated off the walls of the bar, creating a macabre soundtrack for the unfolding massacre. Each roar seemed to come from a place very deep, very ancient, as if the entire human evolutionary lineage were being undone in a matter of minutes. The creature that had emerged represented something civilization had tried to bury for millennia. The lights in the establishment began to flicker, creating an even more sinister atmosphere. Perhaps it was a result of the damage caused during the panic, or perhaps Marcus's own supernatural presence was interfering with the electricity. Shadows danced across the walls, creating optical illusions that made the carnage seem even more surreal. At times, Marcus's silhouette projected on the wall vaguely resembled an ordinary man. At others, it seemed completely inhuman. The last conscious customer, a middle-aged man who had hidden in the bathroom, could hear everything through the rickety door separating him from the massacre. He held his cell phone with trembling hands, trying to dial 911, but couldn't form coherent words when the operator answered. How could anyone explain what was happening? How could they describe a transformation that defied all logic and reason? The police siren approaching the Moonlight Tavern added a new layer of tension to the already charged atmosphere of the establishment. Marcus, in his semi-transformed state, could hear the sound long before any human ear could detect it. His animal instincts interpreted the siren as a territorial threat, triggering even more intense aggression. The creature growled at the windows as if it could intimidate approaching vehicles through the force of its supernatural presence. The first team of officers to arrive on the scene was unprepared for what they would find. Officer James Morrison and his partner, Officer Lisa Chen, had responded to bar disturbances dozens of times during their careers. They expected to find a typical brawl, perhaps a few minor injuries and a few intoxicated arrestees. When they approached the windows of the establishment and saw the scenes of carnage illuminated by the dim light of the still-working streetlights, both froze for precious seconds. Morrison tried to use his radio to request backup, but his voice faltered as he struggled to describe what he saw. How could he explain to his superiors that a man had partially transformed into something straight out of a horror film? How could he describe the methodical brutality that had turned a family bar into a nightmare scenario? His words came out garbled and incoherent, prompting emergency dispatch to request clarifications he simply couldn't provide. Chen decided to act first, drawing her service weapon and trying to find a safe angle to enter the establishment. But through the windows, she could see that Marcus had detected her presence. The creature's eyes, still partially human but glowing with an otherworldly intensity, fixed on her with a predatory precision that made her blood run cold. It was like being watched by a wild animal calculating the best moment to strike. Marcus moved toward the main entrance with a fluidity that was neither entirely human nor entirely animal. His footsteps were silent despite his increased weight, and he seemed to float above the floor covered in debris and blood. The solid oak front door offered no significant resistance to his enhanced strength. Chen instinctively recoiled, her police training clashing with a primal fear she had never experienced before. The confrontation began when Marcus burst through the front door. The metal hinges shattered, as if made of paper, and pieces of wood flew in all directions. Morrison fired 3 quick shots, all true to the center of Marcus's chest, but the bullets seemed to have little effect on the transformed creature. Marcus staggered slightly, more from surprise than actual pain, and the wounds began to visually heal as the officers watched in growing horror. Chen tried to flank Marcus on the right, but he anticipated her move with uncanny perception. In a fluid movement that defied human physics, Marcus turned and leaped toward her, covering an impossible distance in a split second. The claws that had replaced his human nails glinted in the streetlights, creating silvery trails in the night air. The first officer fell before he could react properly. Morrison watched in horror as his partner of 5 years was torn apart by the creature Marcus had become. His 20 years of police training had not prepared him to face something that seemed to have sprung straight from humanity's nightmares. He kept firing, each shot echoing through the silent street, but knowing intuitively that conventional weapons would be useless against what Marcus had become. The moonlight, which had been the initial catalyst for Marcus's transformation, now seemed to fuel his supernatural strength. Each silver ray that touched his mutated skin intensified his capabilities, making him faster, stronger, more lethal. Morrison realized this connection when he noticed that Marcus seemed to deliberately position himself in the direct light of the satellite, as if recharging himself with cosmic energy. The next few hours transformed the quiet streets of Portland into an urban battlefield that defied all comprehension. Marcus, now completely overcome by his werewolf instincts, had abandoned the bar and begun a rampage of destruction through the surrounding neighborhoods. His transformation continued to evolve. The last vestiges of his human appearance gradually disappeared, replaced by increasingly bestial features. The orange shirt he had worn during his shift hung in tatters from his muscular torso, a pathetic reminder of the ordinary man he had been hours before. The first neighborhood Marcus invaded was primarily residential, with wooden houses characteristic of the American Northwest architecture. Families slept peacefully, oblivious to the nightmare approaching their doors. Marcus could smell human life emanating from every residence. Adults, children, the elderly, all equally vulnerable to his newly awakened predatory instincts. His supernatural hearing picked up heartbeats through the walls, creating a sonic map of the potential victims around him. The first house he broke into belonged to the Thompsons, a family unrelated to Marcus despite their shared surname. Robert Thompson awoke to the sound of glass shattering downstairs. His first reaction was to assume it was a common burglary. He grabbed the baseball bat he kept by his bed and started downstairs to confront the intruder. His wife, Jennifer, remained in the bedroom with their 2 young children, following the family security protocol they had discussed many times, but never imagined they would need to use. Robert found Marcus in the living room, an impossible figure that defied his grasp of reality. The creature stood amid the wreckage of his picture window, sniffing the air like a wild animal that had wandered into the wrong territory. When their eyes met, Robert saw something that completely paralyzed him. A residual human intelligence behind the bestial instincts, as if the creature were aware of its own actions, but unable to control them. The baseball bat proved as useless as the officer's weapons. Marcus shattered it with a single bite, leaving Robert disarmed and terrified. But instead of attacking immediately, the creature seemed to hesitate, as if some fragment of Marcus's human consciousness was fighting its predatory impulses. This hesitation lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough time for Robert to shout a warning to his family before his fate was sealed. Jennifer Thompson heard her husband's agonized scream and instinctively knew something far worse than a common robbery was happening. She gathered her 2 children, 8-year-old Emily and 5-year-old Michael, and hid them in the master bedroom closet, whispering desperate instructions to them to remain completely silent. But Marcus could hear her racing heartbeat, smell her fear, and her heavy footsteps on the stairs announced that there was no safe hiding place anywhere in the house. The carnage continued house by house, a methodical progression of terror that transformed a peaceful neighborhood into a nightmare scenario. Marcus showed no preference for age or gender. All humans were equally prey to the creature he had transformed into. His supernatural strength rendered useless locked doors, barricaded windows, or any other improvised defenses the desperate residents attempted. Meanwhile, more police units arrived in the area, but their standard training protocols were completely inadequate for dealing with a supernatural threat. Radio reports became increasingly incoherent and contradictory. Experienced officers attempted to describe something that shouldn't actually exist, using technical language for events that defied all logic. Dawn brought an unexpected transformation to Marcus Thompson. As the first rays of sunlight touched his blood and fur-covered skin, the ferocious creature that had terrorized Portland all night began to retreat. The reverse metamorphosis was as painful as the original. His muscles contracted violently, his claws retracted, leaving open wounds on his fingers, and the snout that had dominated his face gradually returned to human proportions. Marcus awoke naked and disoriented in a dark alley, surrounded by evidence of the carnage he could not fully recall. Memories of the previous night came to him in disjointed fragments, like pieces of a nightmare that insisted on remaining real. Marcus could recall the feeling of absolute power, the primal euphoria of the hunt, the metallic taste of blood in his mouth. But these memories seemed to belong to someone else, to an entity that had taken control of his body and used it for unimaginable purposes. He touched his face with trembling hands, checking to see if they were still human, if the transformation had truly ended. The sound of sirens echoed through the city like a constant wail. Ambulances, fire engines, and more police cruisers moved in frantic patterns through Portland's streets, responding to reports that defied all credibility. Marcus crawled to a puddle of rainwater and saw his reflection. He was still recognizable as the man he had been, but there was something different in his eyes, a residual wildness that suggested the creature hadn't completely disappeared. merely gone to sleep. Local authorities were confronted with a crime scene they could neither explain nor adequately classify. The bodies scattered throughout the Moonlight Tavern, and the homes in the residential neighborhood bore wounds unrelated to any known weapon. Forensic investigators, men and women with decades of experience in violent crime, found themselves unable to form coherent theories about what could have caused such systematic destruction. Dr. Patricia Wells, the chief medical examiner, examined the bodies with growing disquiet. The claw marks were too deep to have been made by any known animal in the region. The force required to inflict some of the injuries exceeded normal human capabilities. But the alternative, accepting that something supernatural had caused the massacre, went against her entire scientific background. She decided to officially classify the deaths as the result of an unidentified animal attack, knowing that this inadequate explanation would raise more questions than answers. Marcus managed to reach his apartment undetected by the authorities patrolling the streets. His rational mind tried to convince him that it had all been an elaborate nightmare, a psychotic reaction to the stress of work. But the physical evidence was undeniable. His clothes were torn, his body bore scratches and wounds he couldn't explain, and there was blood under his fingernails that was definitely not his own. As Marcus tried to process the previous night's events, he began to realize that something fundamental had shifted within him. His senses remained sharper than usual. He could hear conversations from distant apartments, smell scents that would previously have gone unnoticed. More disturbingly, he felt a constant hunger that couldn't be satisfied with ordinary food. It was as if his body was craving something more primal, more carnal. Local news began to cover the events as the worst multiple crime in Portland history. Reporters speculated about satanic cults, coordinated gang attacks, or even the possibility of a serial killer with superhuman physical strength. None of these theories came close to the impossible truth that an ordinary man had literally transformed into a monster and slaughtered innocents under the influence of a full moon. Marcus watched the news with growing horror, recognizing the faces of some of the victims appearing on the screen. They were innocent people, entire families destroyed by the creature he had become. The guilt he felt was overwhelming, but it was complicated by the fact that he genuinely couldn't control his actions during the transformation. Was he responsible for the crimes he couldn't prevent? This question would haunt him for days to come. As night approached again, Marcus felt familiar changes beginning in his body. His muscles twitched subtly, his teeth sharpened, and a primal heat crept up his spine. The crescent moon appearing on the horizon exerted a magnetic pull he couldn't ignore. Marcus realized with horror that the transformation hadn't been a one-time event. It was a cycle that would repeat itself with each full moon, transforming him into the monster that had destroyed so many lives. He tried to lock himself in his apartment, to tie his own hands, to do anything to prevent another massacre. But in the back of his mind, the savage part that had awakened whispered promises of power and freedom that his human consciousness found simultaneously repugnant and seductive. The struggle between the man he had been and the creature he was destined to become had only just begun, and Marcus was unsure which side would ultimately prevail. As the moon waxed in the Portland night sky, somewhere in the city, a new transformation was about to begin. And this time Marcus knew exactly what was happening to him.